Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another installment in the Otsego County Conservation Association webinar series. Today's topic, Invaders from Earth, Invasive Species Do's and Don'ts. My name is Jeff O'Handley. I'm the Program Director for OCCA, and I will be leading today's program. And I'd like to thank everybody for sharing part of your day with me, and I look forward to the time when we can do this in person. And to help me along, I'm just going to picture a room full of people smiling and offering positive feedback. So just as we get started, some do's and don'ts for us. Our ground rules: please mute your microphone if you have one. This way we don't inadvertently get the sound of barking dogs or ringing telephones or crunching chips spilling over into the webinar. You may ask questions at any time using the chat window. I definitely look forward to interaction. If it's something that I can answer right away, I will do so. I may defer it to a later point in the program, depending on. And if you find that we miss your question, you can certainly use the raise hand feature to let us know that you are there. Okay, so let's get started. Okay. Just to introduce Otsego County Conservation Association, in case you are not familiar with us, OCCA is a private nonprofit environmental organization. We were founded originally in 1968 by a group of citizens who were primarily concerned with sustainable forestry in the region. As happens with many not-for-profit organizations, our mission grew and expanded based on need, as well as the interest of the board of directors and the people involved with the organization. It grew to include recycling and solid waste issues, invasive species, lots of water quality. We're very well associated with Otsego Lake, for example, as well as municipal planning and advocacy. We do see ourselves as a science-based organization. We make our decisions based on science, and we try to be a strong advocate for the environment and to engage our citizens and raise awareness. And we do this currently with a full-time staff of 3 and a permanent part-timer and several interns who help us through the year, and with lots of help from people like yourselves who help us out as volunteers or donors, for example, or members. Okay. Just about myself, again, I'm the program director, so I do a lot of the public programming and nature walks and programs of that sort, as well as the invasive species program. I graduated from college with a degree in natural resource management in wildlife science. I was a long time as a kid interested in the environment and the outdoors. I have been an environmental educator primarily for longer than I'd care to say. And I have worked full-time with Otsego County Conservation Association since 2013. Before that, I had worked with the organization both as a volunteer and as a partner and as a subcontractor through various other agencies. So a long-term involvement with OCCA. My email is there on the slide, as well as my phone number. I'm not in the office at this point, but I do check messages and can be reached there, and we will make sure this is posted again at the end. Now, though I've only been working full-time with OCCA for 7 years, I do have a long-term familiarity with invasive species. You see, when I was a kid, I had a fondness for monster movies, like a lot of these 1950s era monster movies. And there were really 2 types of film. One of them was that these extraterrestrial invaders like the Blob or Martians that were coming to take over the world and eat the human race or enslave the human race. And then the other side was earthbound creatures that through monkeying around by humans, nuclear fallout, or scientific tests grew to gargantuan sizes and were trying to eat or enslave the human race. So invasive species of a sort, but not something we generally have to worry about. The reality is what we have to fear is usually far less spectacular than giant ants or gelatinous blobs from outer space. Um, but they do have a much more significant impact on our world than these movie creatures. Okay, this picture here is of a gypsy moth, a small moth that is an invasive species. Okay, so the first thing we really need to do is to define what we mean by invasive species. And there are several definitions out there. Um, Depending on the state you live in, your state may have a slightly different definition, but they all generally agree that invasive species are plants or animals, really any organism that, part one, is not native to the area in question and cause or are likely to cause harm to the economy, the environment, and or human health. So just to break that down very quickly, not native means that it's an animal or a plant or an organism that is not normally found in the environment you're looking at. So a obvious example would be here in central New York State, you would not expect to find polar bears wandering through your backyard. Okay? They are not native. Okay? The second part, cause or are likely to cause harm to the economy, the environment, and or human health. So a species only needs to be not native and check off any one of those three boxes in the second part of the sentence in order to be considered an invasive species. Some species will check off all three, some are two, some are one. Okay, but if it checks off any one of those boxes, then it would be considered an invasive species. Okay, so we're going to take a look quickly at some of those impacts, and later on we will delve into some specific species that we want to look closer at. Okay, so when we talk about harm to the environment, this is a forested area that has been impacted by gypsy moths. So that little moth that I showed a picture of a couple of slides back. The caterpillars will eat the leaves on the trees, and in large numbers, they are capable of defoliating large sections of forest in very little time. So this is an on-the-ground look at gypsy moth damage. You see that those trees have very few leaves on, um, and you know, on the landscape level, excuse me, this is what gypsy moth damage can look like. If you can see my cursor here, all these brown areas are hardwood trees that have been defoliated by a gypsy moth infestation. Okay, so we're looking at possibly hundreds of acres that have been stripped bare of their leaves. These darker green areas here are probably pines, conifers that the gypsy moths do not eat. Okay, so you can see that it has a significant, potential significant impact on a large landscape, right? What this will do is disrupt the ecosystem functions here. If you've taken a walk in a nice deciduous forest in the summer, you know that it's shady, it's cooler than an open area, the air is a little moister and more humid. If you remove all of that canopy, all of the leaves from the upper canopy, now suddenly there's lots of sunlight penetrating. It becomes hotter, it becomes drier. Okay, for species such as nesting songbirds that rely on the canopy as cover for protection from the elements as well as predators, that's gone. It may lead to nest failures or predation. At the soil level, you're talking about, again, drying out, which is bad for many of the invertebrates and small vertebrates that live there. It also exposes the soil to the impacts of rain. Okay? Rain that falls is normally intercepted by the canopy and slowed down. In this case, it would just come pelting down, and that can lead to oversaturation of the soil. It can lead to runoff and erosion, and that in turn will impact, whoops, we're going to go, pardon me, that can lead to impacts into the lakes as sediment comes piling in there and changes in those environments too. So you have a cascading effect on the environment from the impact of invasive species. Now I've previewed what's coming. Okay. In terms of harm to the economy, okay, this is a big one, and this is something that concerns many, many people. Okay, the United States annually, it costs at least $120 billion in damages from invasive species each year. Okay, agriculture alone loses approximately $13 billion in crops due to invasive insects annually. This is a lot of money, and this is money that could be spent on better things. Okay, so the images we're looking at are a side by side of the same street shown before and after treatment for an Asian longhorned beetle infestation. That's an invasive insect. Between 1996, when the Asian longhorned beetle was first discovered in New York City, or first detected in New York City, I should say, and 2017, the United States Department of Agriculture spent $640 million on Asian longhorned beetle eradication and control projects. Okay, and that does not include funds that were spent locally by parks agencies, by homeowners and whatnot. Okay, and USDA is currently allocating around $30 million per year for Asian longhorned beetle alone. Okay, the treatment for something like Asian longhorned beetle is pretty severe. It attacks trees and can cause some structural weakness in the trees, which leads to limbs falling down, which you don't want. So the treatment is you remove the trees, which we see again the before and after. Okay. In terms of other economic impacts, it's estimated that good tree cover can raise property values in residential areas by as much as 7%. So the homeowners in this neighborhood are suddenly, no doubt, finding that their property values are reduced. Trees also have a mitigating impact on heating and cooling bills. So you have again cascading impacts this time to the economy. Just on a side note, I worked in Central Park down in New York City in 1996 when the Asian longhorned beetle was found. And the park's plan was that if they found an Asian longhorned beetle in one tree, that tree would be cut down um, and either chipped to like half-inch particles or burned on site. And the stumps would be ground below ground level, and then any tree touching that one tree would also come down. So applying that in this street scene on the left, you see this big tree here on the right, and it reaches across, and it's probably pretty much touching this tree across the street. That's part of how you end up with an entire block with all of its hardwood trees removed. Okay. Since Asian longhorned beetle was found in this country, 5 states have removed approximately 180,000 trees. And in the case of McCarran Park in Greenpoint, which was sort of ground zero for Asian longhorned beetle, every mature tree was taken down from that park. Okay. And finally, in 2019, they declared the Asian longhorned beetle eradicated from New York City. So it's a fight that comes at great economic cost and takes lots and lots of time. Okay. Uh, Moving on, we have harm to human health. That picture in the upper left is my leg after exposure to the sap from wild parsnip. Um, the wild parsnip sap can cause a condition known as phytophotodermatitis, which is one of my favorite words in the English language because if you break it down, it means exactly what it says. But this is essentially it's a burn. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. Okay. For me, it was a mild case. It didn't even hurt. But for other people, if they get it extensively, it can lead to severe injury. The cousin of the wild parsnip, giant hogweed, can cause severe reactions requiring hospitalization and skin graft type of surgery. So, potentially very dangerous. The lower right is a picture of the Asian tiger mosquito, which is believed to have arrived in the United States around 1985 in tires that came from Asia. It potentially carries a wide variety of illnesses, including dengue, and I think I pronounced that right, yellow fever, and possibly Zika. It has also been implicated in the transmission of other bacteria to humans that can lead to conditions such as encephalitis. Okay. So again, invasive species, not native to the area. In this case, they can cause harm to human health. Okay. Any questions so far? Please feel free to hit the chat bar. If not, we're going to move on to that next question of how do they get here? Okay, there are 3 major pathways for invasive species introductions, and I actually hinted at one of them with the tiger mosquito, but first, our first method is deliberate introductions. Okay. Sometimes people will deliberately release or plant species in an area where they're not normally found. And the reasons for these are varied. It could be for food purposes. It could be for aesthetics and ornamentation. Sometimes for utility, such as certain plants that were planted for erosion control and later found to be invasive, or even comfort. Sometimes, and I think this is probably more prevalent in the past, that people traveling to a new land from their old home would sometimes bring things with them because it's familiar. Okay. One of the most famous deliberate introductions would be with the European starling, which is a familiar species of bird. Starlings, about 100 pairs of starlings were released in Central Park in the late 1800s by a group of people who were interested in having the park full of the birds mentioned in Shakespeare. So from that 100 pairs in the middle 1800s, we now have an estimated 200 million European starlings that are found in every one of the lower 48 states, every Canadian province, parts of Alaska, and parts of Mexico. Okay, this is a very numerous bird. What's also interesting is that there had been several attempts to introduce the starling before that did not succeed for some reason. Whether they didn't bring enough birds or the conditions were just slightly different, we don't know. Okay, but a deliberate introduction, and the starling has had an impact on native songbirds as well as agriculture. It can be an agricultural pest. Okay, so deliberate introductions. Second is they can escape cultivation and captivity. We're going to harken back to that gypsy moth I showed you the picture of right at the start, and the gypsy moth damage. Okay. The gypsy moth was imported from Europe in the 1800s by a fellow in Medford, Massachusetts, who was interested in starting a United States silk trade. He actually did a lot of things right. He had them in his backyard, which was very well enclosed with screens and all kinds of things. But a storm came through and knocked a tree down that put a hole in his fencing or his screening, and the gypsy moths got out. Okay. Now they are found pretty much from Massachusetts and Maine all the way out to the Midwest and down as far south as Virginia, with, again, significant impacts on our environment. I can remember as a kid when gypsy moths hit Long Island, and you didn't want to be outside under a tree when during big infestation years. Um, and finally, one of the biggest ways is hitchhiking. Those of us who live in central New York and around Otsego Lake or Canandaigua Lake are very familiar with zebra mussels, which is a shellfish from sort of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. This came over in the ballast of ships. So the ships would come across the Atlantic Ocean carrying cargo and also full of ballast water. They get into the Great Lakes and they discharge ballast right in the lake, and that would eject zebra mussels, which have become established across the Great Lakes and across much of the eastern part of the country and into Lake Otsego, probably around 2010 or so. Okay. Similarly, if you have a boat and you take it out and spend a few hours or a few days in a lake with zebra mussels, you may well go home with zebra mussels attached to your boat. Okay. So those are our three major methods of invasive species transportation. Okay, so next what we're going to do is deal with 6 specific invasive species to watch for. And for each of these species, we'll talk about how you recognize it, a little bit about where it came from and where it can be found, and some do's and don'ts for how to treat it or how to behave around it. Okay, and 4 of these species are here pretty commonly. One of these species is very newly arrived in the county, and one has not been found in New York State yet, but we want to be ready. Okay. Any questions? Okay, we'll move on. First species is Japanese knotweed, and this is a plant that I talk about this to people all the time, and a lot of times they'll say, I've never seen this plant before. And then the next time I see them after we cover it, they say, oh my gosh, I see this everywhere. If you're not familiar with it by the name of Japanese knotweed, you might know it as Japanese bamboo, or a plant that looks like bamboo. It is not a bamboo. Bamboo is actually a type of grass, and this is not, although it has similar look. It is native to Eastern Asia, Japan, Korea, and China, and was introduced in the late 1800s as an ornamental. Okay, Japanese knotweed is an extremely aggressive grower. It grows very fast. It reproduces ridiculously easy, and in its native range, it colonizes soils like volcanic ash. Okay, so it can grow in poor conditions, and it's a colonizer, which makes it very well suited to becoming an invasive. Okay. Uh, this is the leaf or a couple of leaves of Japanese knotweed. It can vary in size from a couple of inches long to probably 7 or 8 inches long. And it'll vary a little bit in shape, but it's always somewhat triangular like that, pointed at the tip, and either kind of flat across the base here in this one, or with a slight kind of heart shape. Okay, and I mentioned that it's not a grass. You notice that it does have a central vein running up and down the leaf, and then veins that come out from the sides from that central rib. Okay, in grasses, all of the veins run parallel to each other. Right, just real quick. So at this time of year, or not quite this time of year, but within a couple of weeks, what you're going to start seeing, is this plant emerging from the ground. And it looks a little bit like asparagus when it first comes up. Okay, and it is capable of growing ridiculously fast. It can grow up to about 3 feet in a single week. There are some time-lapse video or time-lapse photography of Japanese knotweed growth available on the web. It's kind of frightening. Okay, and you see at this early stage, the leaves are just starting to sprout, and it's again pretty much a single stalk. Okay, the image on the right shows you a close-up of the stem. They're very smooth, typically green. Sometimes they do get a little bit purple. And then the key diagnostic is this swollen node right here. And it has what's called a jointed stem. So it's a series of smooth portions with these swollen nodes every few inches. Okay, if you cut the stems in half in between the nodes, it's hollow. Again, another good distinguishing characteristic. Okay, and something that we're not going to see in this is that part of why it grows so well is that it spreads by horizontal roots that grow underground called rhizomes. Okay, let's take a look. So on the landscape level, the picture on the left shows a stand of knotweed along a road edge. Oh, this whole entire thing from one end of the photo to almost the other is Japanese knotweed. On the right, we see the flowers. It will flower in late summer, in around August. They're white little spikes, kind of soft spikes, sometimes a little creamy colored. Okay, it's very popular for bees. I will say that bees and wasps like it. And I've had somebody tell me that Japanese knotweed honey is very, very tasty. But as a plant, it does not do a lot of good for anything else. It grows so thickly that no plants can grow underneath it. It actually does not really help to stabilize the soil that it grows on, because underneath is all bare. Okay, and if you look at knotweed, very little seems to eat it or live on it, based on my experiences. Okay, it's very common along roadsides due to disturbances from construction. So the power company will come in and they'll string new utility lines, and they'll be trampling on the soil and scraping away the soil and everything. And if there's any parts of knotweed in there, it will grow very aggressively. It also grows very well on riverbanks. If you're canoeing, sometimes you'll go down patches of the river and it's just a wall of Japanese knotweed. It's very unfortunate. Okay, the plant can reproduce from small fragments of the root or the stems, and again, makes it very difficult to deal with. So we'll talk about some do's and don'ts of Japanese knotweed. Do learn to recognize it. And that way, if you see it on your property, you can maybe start to do something about it. Okay. Again, if you look it up, if you need, you'll be able to come back to this webinar, which will be left on our website, to take a look. Also, books and other websites will help you recognize it. But again, once you see it, you pretty much know it all the time. Okay. If you are trying to control it on your property, this is a labor of love. It is a exercise in persistence. You have to cut it repeatedly throughout the growing season. The objective to repeated cutting is that by cutting the vegetative part off, you are depriving the root masses of nutrients that they will need to continue growing. So basically, once it starts growing, you're going to cut it like every 2 weeks through the growing season. Okay. Do clean up all parts of the plant after cutting. Now, I don't think that a single leaf is going to be able to sprout, but if you are cutting the canes, the stems, and you leave a part, particularly the swollen node part, leave it lying on the ground, or you leave a few stalks lying on the ground, they can re-sprout. Okay, so you want to make sure you clean up all the parts after cutting, rake them up, bag them. Okay. Don't compost this plant. Okay, so the general treatment that you want to do with Japanese knotweed is you cut it up and you put it into garbage bags, thick garbage bags, tie them up, leave them in the sun for a couple of weeks, and they should ultimately rot and kind of liquefy in there, and then it can be disposed of with the trash. If you put it in your compost pile, you are probably going to end up with a lot of Japanese knotweed growing in your compost, or you'll spread it on your garden and you may end up with Japanese knotweed growing out of your garden, and that is something you do not want to do. Similarly, if you cut a bunch of it, don't just throw it over the bank into the backyard somewhere into the woods, okay, because you don't want to spread this plant. If you are using herbicides, okay, do follow instructions exactly. You want to get an herbicide that will work on this type of plant, and you will follow the instructions for the amounts and how to do it. Okay, that is all. Herbicides have a series of problems, but one of the biggest problems with herbicides is people not using them properly. So please follow all directions. Okay. Anybody have any questions on this? Okay. All right. We will move on to another plant, common parsnip. This is a picture of the flower in early to mid-summer. Right. It is a biennial. I think I've got that pronunciation right. Okay, but before we kind of get into identifying the plant, caution, the sap of the plant can cause burns. You remember that picture of my leg from earlier on. Okay, it is native to Eurasia, so from Europe across to parts of Asia, and it has an edible root. Okay, it is related to carrots, Queen Anne's lace, and plants in that family. You can dig up the root and eat them. The expectation is that this was a plant that escaped cultivation, that it was, that escaped cultivation. Okay, sort of a wild ancestor to parsnips that people might actually buy in a store. Okay, I started to mention before that it is a biennial, so it has a 2-year growth cycle. In year 1, this is typically what you'll see throughout the year. It is what's called a rosette, this sort of mess right in here. Okay, so the leaves are formed. It's a what's known as a compound leaf. There is a single stem with multiple what are known as leaflets off the sides and the front. Okay, kind of a scalloped edge, a dissected edge, and there's usually at least 2 sets of leaves popping out from each. So right down in the middle in the ground here would be one of these roots. So there's probably like 3 or 4 parsnip plants at least gathered around here. Okay, and that's all you'll see for the first year. It'll grow, it's growing in the lawn here, as in this case. Okay, in the second year, and you'll see both stages of the plant at once because you have multiple seed banks for multiple years. Okay, in the second year, it will bolt, as they call it, and instead of that basal rosette, you will get a central stem, which will have alternating leaves of this sort. Again, this is that compound leaf that's very similar to to the one from the rosette. And then in the middle of the summer, June and July, it will form these clusters, these flower clusters. Okay, so just a couple of things to recognize in this. It is typically 4 to 5 feet tall. I have seen it as tall as 6 feet and, short like 2 to 3 feet, depending on when it's growing. But typically it's 4 to 5 feet tall. Okay, if you look closely at the stems, they are smooth and green, and they will have, whoops, did that again. They will have vertical grooves running up and down the length of the stem. Okay. And then these small these clusters of flowers in what they call an umbel. And this is often somewhat flat topped and spreading. It is, again, similar to the flower of something like a Queen Anne's lace, only a Queen Anne's lace flower tends to be tightly clustered, and this is more loose and spreading. Okay. And I will note that there are 2 species of goldenrod, native goldenrods, that have a flat-topped flower head like this, right? We typically see goldenrod as a spike flower. Okay, there are at least 2 species of goldenrod that are shaped like this, but those will flower in August and September. Okay, so if you see something with this kind of flower in August and September, it's almost certainly going to be goldenrod and not the parsnip. The parsnip will only be flowering in that early to mid part of the summer. Okay. Once you get into later July and August, those flowers will turn brown and will go to seed, and it will look more like this. Okay, you see those seeds, and those seeds, once they are kind of ripe, are very, very easy to dislodge, and you want to be very careful about handling the flower at this point. Okay. So this is what it looks like on the landscape. Okay. And typically all of this stuff here is all parsnip, and this is what we're seeing more and more in Otsego County. Again, as an invasive, it tends to colonize initially in areas where there's disturbance, and road edges have a lot of disturbance from ditching or, again, power lines or cars pulling over on the side. But over the course of several years, the seeds will spread, and you'll see it kind of back up off the road and into fields along the roads, and into pastures, and into into your lawn. I'm seeing this happen on my lawn too. There's a whole bunch along the ditch, and it's backing up into the lawn. Okay. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts on our common parsnip. Okay, do avoid burns. If you are working with parsnip, if you are cutting parsnip, weed whacking where there's parsnip, you want to wear long sleeves, pants, and gloves. And you may want to wear eye protection too, and especially if you're working with a weed whacker, that's always a good idea anyway, right? Do wash tools and clothing afterward, okay? So just the way the mechanic works on this is that the sap of the plant contains a chemical that, when it gets onto your skin and absorbs into your skin and then is exposed to sunlight, typically about 24 hours later, you can get essentially a burn. It's like a severe sunburn. It's almost like the sap, the chemical in the sap makes your skin hypersensitive to sunlight. Okay, so if you're handling the material at all, you want to make sure that you take a shower, wash thoroughly with soap and water to get that sap off of your skin. Okay, and again, wash your tools and clothing afterwards. I don't know how long the sap and the chemical will remain active afterward. Just always a good idea. Okay, again, like our Japanese knotweed, if you're trying to control it on your property, do cut it regularly in the growing season. So May through flowering. While it's flowering, you can continue to cut it. It does not seem to spread from parts of the plant being left behind. Okay. However, do not mow once seeds appear. Okay, and the reason is, if you're mowing it, if you're just chopping it down and chopping it up, some of those seeds are probably going to get spread by the lawnmower and put right down in the soil. Okay, what you can do, especially if you have a small infestation and you have allowed it to get to seeding portion, is very carefully, with proper gloves, cut the seed heads off and throw them in a bag. Okay, and then treat it kind of like we did with our knotweed, where you just, let it sit in the sun and boil and bake away. Okay, but if you're going to go and chop the plants down or weed whack the plant once the seeds appear, you're only going to be spreading it further. Okay, any questions? Okay. All right, we're going to move into the insect world. And this is probably the only time you're ever going to see this creature, except in other pictures on the web. The emerald ash borer. This is an insect that is known to be in Otsego County. Okay, and it attacks exclusively ash trees. We have 4 species of ash trees in this part of New York State, in New York State in general. Okay, and we'll just mention that ash trees do make up about 8% or so of the forest across upstate New York. Okay. This insect, the adult here in itself, doesn't do a whole lot of damage. It feeds on green leaves during the course of the summer. You will probably never see it because it is often up high in the tree. Okay. Emerald ash borer was introduced to the United States around 2002. In Michigan, it was first detected. It found its way to New York State around 2009 and Otsego County 2013, and is slowly spreading. Okay, so you will not see the insect itself. Well, I'm just going to go back for a second. I mentioned that the adult itself doesn't do a whole lot of damage to the tree. It doesn't hurt the tree in and of itself. The damage comes from the larva. Okay, on the left-hand side, this little wormy, this little wormy critter is the emerald ash borer larva. So the adults will lay their eggs on the bark of the tree. When they hatch, the tiny little larvae tunnel through the bark, and they live in a very thin layer between the bark and the center wood of the tree. And what these critters do is they chew their way through a section of the tree known as the phloem, which is vascular tissue. It transports water and nutrients around the tree. Okay. One larva, like the one on the left, by itself won't do much harm. They typically, by the way, will travel in a zigzag pattern, sort of an S-shaped series of loops back and forth on themselves moving forward. Okay, so one larva is not going to do too much damage. The problem is each adult lays, 60 to 100 eggs. And if you have 60 or 100 larvae, tunneling around underneath the bark, that is a problem. And then if you have an infestation with lots of adults laying lots of eggs, what you end up with is what you see on the right, with these overlapping patterns of the larvae chewing their way through. They'll eventually work their way all the way around the tree or the limbs, and that will basically starve the tree. It can no longer ship water up. It can no longer ship nutrients down. Okay, a healthy ash tree can be killed by an infestation of emerald ash borer in under 10 years. Okay, so the larvae, by the way, typically feed from late summer through the fall. They will go through a dormant period, and then in the spring, the larva will continue feeding briefly and then go into a pupa stage, a resting stage, for about 2 weeks, when they will emerge as adults. Okay. Yeah, so that is the issue. So I'm going to jump into emerald ash borer do's and don'ts first. So our first thing is to learn your ash trees. We have a link that we will be posting to a handy guide to how to recognize your ash trees from other trees. So this way you know if you have one on your property. Okay. But I don't really have time to get into that now. Don't move firewood. Okay, there we go. It's posted in the chat. Okay, so do not move firewood. New York State regulations prohibit moving untreated firewood more than 50 miles from the source. And the reason is, if you have a chunk of firewood that's, a foot long, there's a possibility that the larva or a pupa is beneath the bark, and you go traveling with it someplace else, and then you leave it on the pile for a while. That larva can finish developing, hatch as an adult, and suddenly there's a new infestation brought to another area. This is the primary way that emerald ash borer is moving, by the way. Okay, and do learn the signs of an infestation. Okay, so it is EAB, emerald ash borer, is across the southern tier. It's throughout Pennsylvania. It is working its way up into Otsego County from the Unadilla area. And so, the signs of an infestation. First is what is known as crown thinning. And if you look at this image here, you see how there are some leaves on it, but it's very, very thin and very, very sparse, especially if you compare it to those trees in the background across the street, where they're probably maples, nice thick midsummer canopy, whereas this is just mostly empty space. Okay, you will also see dead and dying branches and limbs up high on the tree, again, because that larva is feeding and cutting off the flow of nutrients. And then finally, what's known as epicormic branching. And I don't have a good image of it, but if you see at the base of this tree, there's this shrubby growth. And sometimes you'll see, the tree will start to look like a chia pet almost. You'll go halfway up the bark and there will just be this sort of explosion of leaves coming right out of the trunk or right out of a branch. As the tree is being stressed by the insect, it desperately puts out new growth in an attempt to catch sunlight and make some food for itself. Okay, those are some signs of emerald ash borer, but they're not definitive because trees will react to stress, drought, or other, fungi or other pathogens in a similar way. Slightly more definitive signs of emerald ash borer is what's known as blonding. Okay, on the left-hand side, we get a good up-close look at this, and then on the right, you see this tree, this ash tree right in the middle with all these white patches. So what'll happen is about the only thing that eats emerald ash borer are woodpeckers, and they will work on the tree and they will chip at the bark in search of the larva, and that leads to large patches of bark being flaked off. Okay, now again, that's not a definitive sign of not super definitive of emerald ash borer, because there are, again, other pests that woodpeckers might be going after. One of the final definitive signs are these, what are called D-shaped exit holes. Okay, so I mentioned that the larva will pupate underneath the bark and emerge as an adult, a fully grown little green beetle adult, and they get out of the tree by chewing their way through. And the shape of the hole as they chew their way out is kind of rounded on the top and kind of flat on the bottom, sort of shaped like a D, or it might be the other way. It might be flat on the top and round on the bottom. I don't remember. Each of these holes is about 3 millimeters across. Okay, so they're very, very small. You really have to be looking for them. You got to get up close and personal to your tree. So if you have an ash tree on your property and you notice that, it's getting thin during the summer, or you're starting to see a lot of dying branches, you want to get up close and personal and start looking for these holes. Now, there are other insects that behave in similar ways that might have round holes. If it's round holes, it's something else and probably not what's killing your tree. But if it's these D-shaped holes, you do have problems. There are some preventatives for emerald ash borer. It's not practical on a forest scale, but on a individual property owner scale, there are some sprays that can be used to treat them preemptively. There's also direct injection of chemicals right into the trunk of the tree that will then prevent ash borer for about 7 or 8 years, but you'll have to, do it over and over again. That is one where you would talk to an arborist about it. Okay. Any questions? Okay, I am moving way too slow. We're going to move to the water now for our next invasive species, European frogbit. This is a small plant, looks a little bit like a lily pad that prefers ponds and slow-moving water. It was being studied at a place up in Ottawa, Canada, and escaped cultivation there in the 1930s, working its way into the canals around Canada, and eventually down into New York, Lake Champlain area, and sadly, Otsego County. We have one well-established population out near New Berlin. There is a well-established population just north of Otsego County in Weaver Lake, and we're trying to make sure it doesn't get here. Okay, its impact on the environment is that it tends to form dense mats that grow across the surface and disrupt the life of the pond. I will mention that this plant, it looks a little bit like a lily pad, but it is very, very small. This leaf here is maybe the size of a $1/2, quarter to a $1/2 size. So if you find, lily pads, that are 8 inches across, it is not European frogbit. Okay. Here's another image with some plants that we fished out of our pond. Okay. Or one of the sites that we were looking at. Okay, so how it grows is in the late summer, it will drop actually not so much seeds as sort of little dormant buds that will sit on the bottom all winter. And as the water warms in spring, these things will float to the surface and pop out this little collection of leaves. I will go over here that will start to grow. The leaves float on the surface, okay, out of this central point. But then what it does is it sends out what are known as stolons. That's these sort of, they look like spaghetti almost, spaghetti-like strands that grow kind of horizontally. And if we look at the right-hand picture there, so here's one of these little nodes with 4 or 5 leaves, and then there's a stolon, and it goes, 7 or 8 inches and pops out another set of leaves, and then another 7 or 8 inches, and another and another. This plant does not root in the bottom. Okay, it will float across the surface. So these stolons will all form this dense tangling mat. This one here is about 3 feet long. Okay, and then you'll have multiple combinations of this all stretched and tangled up. Okay, so what it does here in this little slew, I guess you'd call it, everything from one end of this picture to the other is frogbit. And I apologize, it's not the greatest picture, but you can kind of see it. It looks very grainy, but this is all European frogbit covering one end of this pond area to the other. And what this will do, again, the leaves are blocking sunlight from penetrating to the bottom, which is going to inhibit the growth of native vegetation. Okay, that can then impact the wildlife in terms of fish and insects and amphibians that would normally live down in that layer. Okay, as in addition, dieback of the plant in the fall, as it starts to die back, it will decompose, and that will consume oxygen, and you can lead to suddenly anoxic conditions. That is, no oxygen in the water, and that can lead to the death of fish and other organisms. Okay. It also impacts recreation. You can't really get a boat through there very easily. You can't fish in that water. You can't swim in that water. Okay. So the best cure for frogbit is, and here's a good image of these folks out in Michigan pulling frogbit out. You see how it comes up in this big, massive tangle. Okay, so the best cure is prevention, but if you do have an infestation, it can be removed by hand or via mechanical means, such as, on a large area, one of these boats that kind of chops up aquatic vegetation. It can also be treated with appropriate herbicides. That is a consult with the experts. Do not just go out there and, throw a bunch of stuff on it. Okay, that's not good. And the plants, the good news is if you do have it and you pull it out of the water, they can be safely composted just away. You just have to make sure that as you're moving it to your compost pile that you're not dropping this in other waters where it's not infested. And finally, you want to properly clean all boats and other equipment when you are done with boating in one of these lakes. Okay, so a couple of do's and don'ts. Do learn to recognize frogbit. Okay, again, plenty of guides online. Do clean your watercraft and gear every time you leave the water and before you put it in the water someplace else. Okay, New York State regulations actually do require this, but don't just think, oh, it's not a power boat, I don't have to worry about it. Clean your canoe, empty it, drain it, treat it, clean your fishing gear, make sure you're not toting plants, and check your trailers too, right? If you're launching a boat. And don't dump unwanted plants outside. So frogbit was also widely available in the aquarium trade. Other plants like hydrilla, Brazilian water weeds and stuff are available via aquarium trades. And, if you have to clean your tank or you decide you don't want it anymore, don't take it outside and dump it. Okay, that is part of how you end up with invasive species in new areas. Okay. And if you do see it, report it. And we're going to talk about this at the end of where these things can go. Oh, look at that. We have a post on how to properly disinfect your boats and watercraft popping up. Thank you. All right, jumping worms. This is I would say these are new arrivals here, but I'm not entirely sure. Jumping worms are actually, there are at least 3 species of worms that are called jumping worms. They're native to Asia. They are named for their behavior. So normal earthworms, if they are come out on the ground, they'll try to kind of crawl away from you. Jumping worms will thrash wildly about. Sometimes called crazy worms or Alabama jumpers or snake worms because of their behavior. Okay? And these guys can, part of what makes them so successful is they can reproduce asexually. They just will leave a bunch of little cocoons, cocoons in the ground that can reproduce into worms. So they outcompete other earthworms, okay, and rapidly overpopulate an area. Okay. Just some general descriptions. They're typically, to help you recognize them if you see them, they're typically about 4 to 5 inches long, not like some of those gigantic night crawlers. Okay, the clitellum, and that, just to go back to this picture, that is that white band around the body. Okay, on jumping worms, the clitellum is flush with the body. It just sort of looks like a discolored area compared to the rest, whereas on other earthworms, it will actually be a raised section, like a almost like a ring that was put on around the worm's body. So for the jumping worms, it will actually be smooth and flush with the body. Okay. There tend to be a brown or gray color, not sort of the pink of worms. And one of the definitive signs, if you have them, is that the soil will be left looking like coffee grounds. You see in that image there, it becomes very, very granular. You'll also find that if you have an area that would normally have a leafy mulch, that will disappear very, very fast because these worms just eat through it like nothing. Okay, as they change the soil, it leads to the roots of plants not having anything to grow in. So you might go to rake your grass, and instead of getting, pulling out the thatch, you'll have the entire grass kind of scraping up out of the ground because the worms are just completely destroying the soil structure. Okay. By the way, I want to mention that almost all earthworms we find in New York State are non-native. During the last period of the glacier, they wiped out all the native earthworms. And so even the night crawlers and things are not native, and we don't really want them in our forests. But the jumping worms are kind of like extreme worms. They just will really destroy our soil. Okay. They are found in parts of Otsego County. I've heard reports of them in Cooperstown as well as Oneonta. I have not seen them myself, but I haven't looked for them as much either. So do's and don'ts: do learn to recognize jumping worms. Report them if you see them. Our cooperative extensions have a good page on jumping worms, and we will get that link posted shortly. Okay. Don't buy or use jumping worms for bait or vermicomposting. So I want to say like 10 or 15 years ago, I remember there was a huge load of information going around about creating worm bins, and it was popular for schools to do worm bins, and they wanted people, everybody wanted to do worm bins for their kitchen and everything. And the worms that you could buy were red wrigglers or, different things. We don't know, where did they come from? Okay. In some cases, they may well have been these jumping worms. This is probably how they got introduced into this area. Okay. They were also good for fishing bait for similar reasons. Okay. So don't buy them. This is going to sound cruel, but if you go fishing and you are using worms, and it's any worm, and you are done fishing for the day and you can't keep the worms, do not release them. Do not set them free. As cruel as it sounds to kill the worms, basically seal them in a bag, and you can either leave them in the sun shortly to dry out, or put them in the garbage. They will not last very long. But if you're opening up that container and dumping them out on the ground, you are potentially spreading non-native species and potentially leading to problems. Okay, so do destroy unused worms after use. Sorry. Also, if you are buying compost for your garden, for your property, check to find out if it has been heat treated, which will destroy worms or other pests. You should be able to find that out from your dealer pretty easily. And it's important, again, because sometimes these things will live in the compost. Okay. Let me go back. One other thing I would say, if you're buying nursery stock, new plants from the nursery, buy bare root, and also check the roots very carefully for either worms or little worm cocoons, which are like little black BBs, okay, that might be stuck to those roots. So check those carefully. Okay, spotted lanternfly. This is not here yet. Okay, again, native to Asia. And I want to change gears for just 1 second. It seems like a lot of the species I've been mentioning are native to parts of Asia, and people, I've gotten that question: how come so many invasive species are coming from Asia? And it's because climatologically, fancy word there, that part of Asia is very similar to the climate we have here in New York State. And in some cases, there are similar plants or things that they feed on. So for the emerald ash borer, China and Korea have ash trees, different species of ash, but similar to what we have. So when they got over here, they found a climate that was similar to what they were used to, and they found trees and food sources similar to what they were used to. Okay, spotted lanternfly, it's native to Asia. It feeds on over 70 plant species. And part of its impact is that it will promote the growth of sooty mold. I will mention what this means in a little bit. So far in New York State, only dead individuals have been found. Actually, I think one live individual was found in a shipment of stuff coming from Pennsylvania. But there is, as far as we know, no population established in New York State. It is very widespread in southeastern Pennsylvania right now. The picture here is the adult. It is about 1 inch long, so it's not very big. It's very, very distinctive. It's got sort of pinkish tan wings with those very distinct black spots. And then the back part of the wings is kind of that, what they describe as almost like a brick-like pattern. It's like a plant hopper, okay? Like a little leaf hopper or something, again, about 1 inch long, okay? In terms of the life cycle, right? The lanternflies will lay their eggs in fall, and it will look like spackle almost. Okay, they'll lay 60 or so eggs. It's about, the egg mass is typically about 1 inch long. You can actually see these individual dots are lines of eggs, and then they cover it with this material. So it'll look kind of like spackle. And they will lay their eggs on anything that is outside, okay? Trees, lawn furniture, cars, boxes, whatever. They will lay their eggs on it. Okay, they do this again in fall. In the spring, what you will see in April around this time of year is the nymph. This is the immature insect. The first couple of stages are these small critters that are black with white spots that will be found on plants. They're about 1/4 of an inch long. Okay. A little bit later on, they will grow and develop and maybe become about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch long. And as they grow, they take on this red color. They still have black, but you see they still have those white spots. Okay, and eventually they will metamorphose into that adult. Okay, that we see again. So about 1 inch long with those distinctive spots. So it's got spots in all phases of its life. And the adults will typically will show up in July. Okay, whereas the nymphs, those first stage nymphs, will show up in April and May. Okay, okay. Not for the squeamish. This is a spotted lanternfly infestation. Okay. Now the concern with the lanternflies is they feed again on a wide variety of plants, but they also like things like grapes and apples. The grape and apple industry in New York combines for about $385 million in revenue every year, and this is potentially at risk. Okay, recreationally, this is a backyard in Pennsylvania, and this tree is covered with these 1 inch long insects. you don't really want to be sitting out there for a family barbecue with this happening around you. Okay, it definitely impacts recreation and potentially home values. Um, the insects, as they feed, they will suck plant juices and excrete what's known as honeydew, which is sort of a concentrated um, juice, I guess you'd call it, and that will fall down, and you don't want that falling on you. You don't want it, getting on things, and it promotes the growth of sooty mold, which can actually kill your trees. Okay, just I realize I'm pushing an hour here. New York has implemented an exterior quarantine restricting goods imported from areas in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey where the lanternfly has been found. Where they're asking for certifications and inspections um, to hopefully contain the spotted lanternfly. So some real quick do's and don'ts on the spotted lanternfly. Do become familiar with it and the signs of an infestation. Aside from the insects that are all over everything, signs of infestation would include um, wet areas, sort of like weeping on the bark of a tree or plant from the feeding behavior of it, and that sticky honeydew buildup around plants. Okay? Uh, if you have been to an area where there is spotted lanternfly, again, southeastern Pennsylvania in particular, if you spent any time there, a couple of days, check your vehicle carefully. Check inside for adults, check outside for adults and nymphs, look for those speckled egg masses and scrape them off if you find them, okay? Don't transport plants, firewood, or outdoor furniture equipment, particularly from those areas again, okay? So, don't move the patio furniture from your summer home in the Poconos, let's say, back up here. Okay. And if you think you found an insect, one of these critters, do take pictures of it, of the egg masses, or suspected signs of infestation, and report them to spotted lanternfly at dec.ny.gov. If you can get the actual insect, you can freeze it in a baggie and kill it and make sure it gets to people, and they will help find out if this is exactly what we have or not. Okay. Oh boy. So as I want to wrap up here, I want to cover some of the invasive species resources that will help you with, with learning more. One of the big ones, of course, is the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation website posted here. And my one issue with it, they have great information, very specifically on species, on regulations, on everything. My one issue with DEC sometimes is that you don't just go and find one place for all invasive species. Terrestrial forest animals are here and aquatic creatures are there, so you kind of have to hunt around a little bit. But they have great information that they keep very, very up to date. Okay, the New York State Invasive Species Information Clearinghouse has very good information on species specifically, along with tips on what management actions you can take, resources on webinars and educational information there. Okay. New York Prism Networks, and I'm going to come back to this one in a second. And then I will mention that the local soil and water conservation districts, cooperative extensions, et cetera, are great sources of information for you. So, if you're not local to Otsego County, check your local cooperative extension or your local soil and water district. Okay. Now, just to mention the PRISM networks, New York State decided in the early 2000s to form a series of regional networks for invasive species, and part of that is there's no one size fits all. The invasives we have here in our region are different from what you have on Long Island, for example, or Western New York. So they formed these regional networks, partnerships for regional invasive species management. They are funded by New York State, but run as a cooperatively with a number of partners. For Otsego County, we are in what's known as the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, or CRISP. Their website is catskillinvasives.org. They have lots of good information. If you find invasive species on your property, they can also help you with resources on how to treat it. They have helped fund a number of OCCA's educational programs and invasive species management programs as well. And we have information on, do we have all? No, we don't have them all in there, but yeah, so that's a great source. Okay. In terms of reporting, oh, there we go. Okay. In terms of reporting, one of the places that we go to all the time is imapinvasives.org. This is a GIS-based data management system that assists managers with finding where infestations are. Citizen science, natural resource professionals all use this. There are, I think, 7 or 8 states hooked into this network, including New York. And it does require a registration. Does require a fairly simple online training. Once you do that, it's pretty easy to use, and you can use a mobile app so that if you're out in a walk somewhere and you find an invasive species, you can use your phone, boom, and report it right there, or you can take information down and upload it from your desktop, and that helps people find out where things are popping. That is a good resource, and they do have special trainings online that can help you learn to use that. Okay. And I guess what I will finish off with saying here is, first off, thank you again for everybody for being part of this. If you are interested in more invasive species work, OCCA does some invasive species volunteer projects. We have been working on water chestnut on a couple of water bodies here where we get out in canoes and hoist this stuff out. It's fun, and it's good work. We've been digging up Japanese knotweed at our base of operations in Mohican Farm, and we always look for volunteers to help out with that as well. So, if you're local, get involved with us. If you are watching this from somewhere else in the state, check some of your local organizations and see who's doing what to help, prevent the spread of invasive species. I will just add that in addition to this webinar, we will be running other webinars, and particularly next week with our Earth Festival celebration, a whole bunch of programming coming. Thank you very much. And if you have any other questions or things you'd like to see, throw it in the chat. And that is our program.